of dignitaries here, but I would like to especially thank Senator Warner for coming out here today, sir, for your patriotism and your great service to our nation. And it's a real honor for me to be on the stage with the granddaughter of General Blackjack Pershing, who led the American Expeditionary Force in World War I. We should recall what a great general he was, and later, between World War I and World War II, he became the Chief of Staff of the Army. And I have the privilege of living in his home right now up at Fort Myers. So, ma'am, thank you so much also for being here. You know, World War I, 100 years ago, and like the Secretary, I too have grandparents and granduncles that fought with both the British and American armies in World War I. It was a horrible war. And at the beginning of that war, in that fateful summer of 1914, in a period of only 6 weeks, the kings and the queens and the czars and the kaisers and the presidents and the prime ministers of Europe, in sequence, made a series of horrific decisions that they thought were not bad at the time, but it resulted 4 years later in an utter catastrophe in which 38 million people died, in which 200,000 Americans were wounded, in which 100,000 more were killed, where if you were a young male in Europe in 1914, you stood a 1 out of 4 chance of being dead by 1918. It was a war that ripped apart 5 empires and utterly destroyed economically, physically, infrastructure, and of course, from a humanitarian standpoint, all of the death and destruction. It ushered in a pandemic flu that killed another 56,000 American soldiers and countless others in the countries of Europe. And it set the conditions for the most horrific war in human history by ushering in World War II with a failed and flawed Treaty of Versailles. And it also set the conditions for the world that we live in today. The boundaries of the Middle East were set in 1918, 1919, and 1920 in the wake of World War I. So the struggles that we see today can be directly attributed to the First World War. And it's more than appropriate, 100 years after the end of that war, to finally begin the erection of a monument to the American participation in that war. And there's many, many lessons to be learned from World War I. There are strategic lessons, there's operational lessons, there's tactical lessons, there's lessons of politics and government and economics. But if there's one lesson most of all to learn, it's the lesson to vow never to let it happen again. And the way to prevent war is to maintain your preparedness for war, in the words of George Washington, our first president. The United States Army under Blackjack Pershing went to war, and in 1916, 2 years or so before the end of the war and a year before he entered into Europe, he was chasing Pancho Villa on the border of Mexico, riding a horse, leading horse-ridden cavalry troops. And he was a one-star at the time. And the Army at that time had less than 200,000 soldiers in it, spread out in mostly constabulary duties. A few years later, the Army went from less than 200,000 to 4 million soldiers and rapidly expanded and mobilized the entire nation. In that time, we also raised the Navy and a Marine Corps and deployed them as well. But prior to 1917, we were in a complete state of unpreparedness. When Blackjack Pershing entered Europe, it took him 9 months to train and equip the United States Army and the Marine forces to fight alongside the British and French allies. A state of unpreparedness led to many casualties in the battles of the Argonne and many others. And the Argonne was the bloodiest battle in U.S. military history. That preparedness was repeated again in World War II and then again in the Korean War. So if there's one lesson for us to learn as a nation, it's to be prepared. If you want to sustain the peace, prepare for war. If you want to sustain the peace, then have large, ready, credible military forces that can do whatever the nation asks it to do in order to ensure this experiment in liberty is passed on to the next generation and the generation after that. As the Chief of Staff of the United States Army, it's my deep honor to be here today and honor those soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines that perished in the First World War. And it's our duty to remember what they fought for, why they fought. It's our duty to carry on that legacy and ensure the peace goes into the future.